Now, if you've been keeping across COP26, the UN Climate Summit taking place in Glasgow, you would have heard impassioned speeches delivered by leaders from the developing world in Africa, Latin America, the Pacific and the Caribbean. Particularly, the island nations in places like the Caribbean see themselves as being on the front line of the environmental crisis. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mayor Motley, told world leaders at the summit to try harder, warning that a rise in global temperatures of 2 degrees amounted to a death sentence for the region. The Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown, expressed his dismay that delegates were talking about reducing carbon emissions by the middle of the century when action was needed now. And the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, had this to say.
While climate change affects all countries, the impact on small island developing states is disproportionately greater. Climate change threatens our very survival. Meeting the 1.5 target is a matter of life and death for us. We are at a pivotal moment in history. All countries must increase their NDC ambitions to get us back on track. Despite significant fiscal constraints and development challenges, Jamaica is acting. We submitted our enhanced NDCs in June 2020, one of the first countries to do so, and launched our implementation plan last month. We have commenced preparation for our 2050 long-term emissions reduction and climate resilience strategy. Colleagues, our actions will determine whether the planet will remain livable for future generations. Let us all play our part and meet this moment with urgent and decisive action.
That's the Jamaican Prime Minister there. Well, for more on COP26, climate change and the Caribbean, I'm joined now in the studio by the Jamaican High Commissioner to Nigeria, Esmond Reid. Lovely to see you again. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. The Jamaican Prime Minister there talking about it as a death sentence if the temperatures rise. Is it that bad?
It is indeed that bad, because certainly small island developing states like Jamaica have for many, many years been feeling the effects of climate change directly, because of course our countries are low-lying coastal states. We depend on tourism as the main source of income, and of course tourism naturally relies on the environment for its sustainability. So we need to have nice beaches, we need to have marine products, we need to be able to have tourists enjoying all that obtains in our environment. But of course, the threat of climate change places all of that at risk, and we have been seeing the effects year on year.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about. What sort of effects have you been seeing?
All right. They are very broad. We've been seeing beach erosion. So large swathes of what used to be pristine white sand beaches have been eroded by rising sea levels. That's another manifestation of climate change. We've also been seeing the warming of the waters around the islands. We've seen increasing drought, for protracted periods. And of course, many of our citizens depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. And we have been seeing more frequent and more severe hurricanes in our region. And that has a significant impact, again, not just on agriculture, but also on infrastructure. Because very often, once you have even a heavy shower of rain, you will have major impact, flooding, you will have, damage to buildings, to roadways. And of course, a hurricane comes not only with rain, but with significant wind. And these are factors which result in major loss and damage to our infrastructure and to our economies. And this is one of the messages that, as you heard my Prime Minister Andrew Holness and other leaders from the Caribbean emphasizing, that loss and damage is something which we have to have addressed urgently in our region.
And obviously your words, his words, echoing what the rest of the island nations of the Caribbean are facing at the moment.
Yes, most definitely. We have been facing these challenges, as I said, for quite some time. And that is why we are at the forefront of the call for urgent action by the rest of the world in terms of taking this stand and taking the steps necessary to make the commitments now to arrest the levels of greenhouse gas emissions and all the things that are contributing to climate change.
Right, but beyond sort of the greenhouse gas emissions, which potentially would affect the entire planet, even though obviously you're in the front line because you're right by the ocean there. I mean, what would you do, for instance, to check the challenge of coastal erosion and a rise in sea levels? I mean, do you have a plan for that? Would you build a coastal defense system or something? What's the plan there?
Well, there are many projects in development to help with, the sustainability of the region. Of course, there are sea defenses that are contemplated. Jamaica has projects looking at dealing with infrastructure development. We have been working with agencies such as the Green Climate Fund. We have been looking at financing mechanisms to support development. Of course, we also even looking inland. Jamaica has a program in place which was launched in 2019 to plant 3 million trees in 3 years. And that is well on the way. Of course, there have been impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic on the pace, but we remain committed to achieving that target. And of course, we have been producing projects that deal with sustaining our mangroves, which of course are important for protecting the marine life around the island. There are many projects, as I said. Dealing with agricultural development, dealing with coastal, coral reef protection, all of these.
These are things that you are already doing.
And projecting to do with, of course, the right investment and support.
Right, because I was going to say, obviously, the UN Climate Summit, which is taking place in Glasgow at the moment, the fourth day is this day, and it's turning its attention to global finance. And of course, that's, the bottom line is the money, isn't it? I mean, what's at stake for Jamaica? What would that money be used for if it was given to Jamaica now? I know you've gone through some of it already just now, but if a pot of money was given to Jamaica, how would you prioritize it?
Well, certainly to put in place a sustainable framework for maintaining our ability to withstand the effects of climate change, because we have had quite a lot of experience thus far, and we are in dialogue with all the scientists and the international bodies such as the IPCC, which have done the modeling, and so we anticipate what will result over time.
But it wouldn't really make any difference, though, to Jamaica, even if money was given to you. I mean, there's not much you can do if the rest of the world isn't reducing its carbon emissions.
Yes, but we can't sit on our hands.
Right.
We are not waiting for the world to do everything for us. We acknowledge that we are in this situation, geographically, and of course, we have to help ourselves, but we rely, of course, on those who are contributing the most to greenhouse gas emissions to do their part, to take responsibility. Again, Prime Minister Holness mentioned the need for equity in the approach at the global level. So this is why the money needs to be put on the table, and it needs to be done now, and we don't need to hear so many nice promises without the actual commitments
Right.
on the table.
So are you encouraged by what's been going on today? Because, I mean, the firms who control trillions of dollars in funds are promising to help achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. I mean, these are the biggest finance companies in the world. I mean, you've got, you know, banks, you've got insurance companies, you've got funding, you know, organizations and that sort of thing. And it's a climate coalition led by the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. So it's got the stamp of authenticity, if you like.
Yes, indeed, and we very much welcome that, and we are encouraging those who are now at the forefront of making these financial commitments to ensure that the mechanisms are in place, because very often the promises are made and then we are tied up in a lot of administrative hurdles which limit the scope.
Bureaucracy.
And by the time you do get some funds, they would have been overtaken by all kinds of challenges. And of course,
so you actually need more funds as you're getting those funds.
Exactly.
Right.
So we really need a concerted effort to deliver on the promises. And we welcome them, as I said. And we look forward to seeing the funds in place to match with the projects that are being developed.
But the fact that COP26 is taking place in Glasgow with the sense of urgency that it's got, does that give you hope?
Yes, we always have to keep hope alive. And that is why we are making sure to be at the table with all of the stakeholders, governments, private sector interests,
right,
NGOs, all of us. It's a global effort.
It's a global emergency.
It's a global emergency, and especially so for us as small island developing states in the Caribbean.
Please stay with us. We want to come back and talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the COP26 UN Climate Summit and the impact of global warming on Caribbean island nations such as Jamaica. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as COP26, the UN's flagship climate conference, continues in Glasgow, today we are looking at the resilience of the island nations of the Caribbean, and my guest is the Jamaican High Commissioner to Nigeria, Esmond Reid. His country, Jamaica, is an island state that is highly vulnerable to the potential impact of climate change, including coastal inundation, changes in sea levels, coastal erosion, and rising temperatures. As global warming becomes a more pressing issue, island nations like Jamaica are championing and taking the lead in trying to tackle some of the biggest challenges of climate change. But how prepared are islands like Jamaica, and what can be done to protect lives and livelihoods in a world of growing climate emergency? And the Jamaican High Commissioner to Nigeria, Esmond Reid, is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us.
My pleasure.
What's it like for ordinary people in Jamaica when it comes to climate change? How are people engaging with the issue on a local level? Are they well informed about climate change? Is it being taught in schools, for example?
Most certainly. We have been actively promoting awareness of climate change from the most fundamental level at the primary school level right up to the tertiary level. Of course, there are active programs by various arms of government as well as private sector bodies and NGOs also who have sought to go into the highways and byways to make people aware of the measures they can take at the individual and community level, and also to ensure, especially when we have our annual hurricane season, for people to take preventative measures and to ensure that we limit the risk to life and property arising from severe weather events.
But I mean, are there people, because I mean, we know that there is a hurricane season that happens every year. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was in Tobago during the hurricane season, and I experienced it firsthand. I mean, it was, to be fair, and not to, denigrate or bring down the urgency of the moment, it was actually quite exciting to be in a hotel room and hear the waves and the pounding of sort of rain and all of that. But beyond that expected hurricane season, which happens every year and which has been happening for centuries, are there people whose lives have become vulnerable in Jamaica as a result of climate change? In other words, people whose you can trace scientifically the fact that their lives have been affected as a result of climate change.
Oh, most definitely. There are many people who are in such a position. As I said, one of the impacts of climate change is on agriculture. So whenever you have major drought, for example, which decimate large swathes of land which were producing maybe various cash crops, then people are compelled to relocate to other areas. Sometimes that might be a challenge to be able to resettle and to...
But I mean, that's happened in the past, though, before the issue of climate change became a big problem. I mean,
but not on the
scale. Right.
Yes,
okay.
there has been an acceleration
Right.
of climate change effects. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the beach erosion is something which has happened in a number of areas. Of course, even with the question of the actual hurricanes, there are people who they lose their houses, their properties, and the mechanisms have to be put in place for shelter
Right.
to be provided for them. And very often, one major area of dislocation is that we have to use public facilities such as schools. So, if, for example, if there's a delay, in returning people to their communities after the hurricane has passed, then that could also have an impact on the reopening of the schools, because people are being housed,
Of course,
inside them. So there are many policy measures and actual activities on the ground which have to be undertaken to address the impacts of climate change. And yes, people have been feeling the effects directly and are aware that it is indeed related to climatic events.
right. So what's the key message of Andrew Holness, the Jamaican Prime Minister, to the COP26 climate summit?
The message is that there is a need for an urgent degree of action on the part of all of us, but especially those with resources who can make the necessary contributions to mitigation and adaptation efforts, especially those being undertaken by us in the Caribbean and other small island developing states.
And he
so
talked
the
about
sense of urgency, and there's the sense of equity and the need for responsibility, because as you yourself highlighted, we in the Caribbean are among those who emit the least.
Absolutely. Well, in Africa as well.
And here in Africa also. But we are suffering a very disproportionate effect of climate change.
Absolutely. And your Prime Minister talked about a death sentence. I think we mentioned this at the outset. When's the execution date? And I'm not trying to trivialize it, but I'm trying to put a figure, a number, some sort of estimate that says that in the next sort of 10, 20 years or whatever, at the current rising rate of the ocean, if something isn't done, we're going to be wiped off the face of the earth.
Well, certainly what the climate experts have said is that this 1.5 degree, maintaining the rise in global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is certainly the ideal target on the current reality. But of course, it really should be lower. But when you take on board all the various factors, you know, industrial development and all of that, that is really what they believe could be pursued now, but it needs to be done within this decade.
Yeah, but already that is not going to be met, because I mean we're hearing people saying, you know, all the dates of sort of 2050, middle of the century, that sort of thing. Already India, China, Nigeria, countries like that are saying, well, we can't do it by 2050, we can do it by 2060 or 2070. What does that say to you?
Well, we have to maintain our engagement with all of our partners at the global level. We recognize that each country has domestic challenges, given that many countries are dependent on fossil fuels for economic development. But at the same time, we have to ensure that there is a global, collective, and concerted action, recognizing that we all have a role to play in support. You know, this is really one of those times when, just as how we have been trying to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to be our brother's keeper. You know, what I am doing in my house has a bearing on what is happening in somebody else's house. And so responsibility is a key element.
Oh, absolutely. So given that, what are your hopes for this Glasgow Climate Conference? We've got about 30 seconds.
Well, I am hoping that all promises and commitments made will find concrete action and reflection in the financial and other outlays that arise from this conference.
Okay, I want to thank you very much indeed, as always, Esmond Reid, who is of course the Jamaican High Commissioner to Nigeria and who is sending out a clarion call to the people at the global conference in Glasgow, the climate summit, to get on with it, basically. Thank you very much indeed.